CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode on Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Bhekinkosi Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the Wits Business School. This morning I'm joined by Malik Dasoo, who is with the African Climate Foundation. Welcome, Malik.
Thanks very much.
And just before we came on set, we were talking about this new looming possible pandemic around the erosion, but also the possibility that the world might run out of arable soil. And I realized that you actually studied soil physics. What is soil physics to begin with?
Sure. So soil physics, we basically, in soil science, you divide it into soil physics and soil chemistry. Soil physics is basically how the structure of soil works, how it's built up, how it gets eroded over time, and how the dynamics within it support plant life and other forms of animal, insect, and fungi life.
And you were telling me that, in fact, I was saying to you that there's an activist who has been arguing that by 2035, the world is likely to run out of soil. And in this case, we're talking about good, usable soil, especially for agriculture purposes. And you were more or less confirming that. And what are the forecasts and trends when it comes to the management of land, but also thinking about the soil? Because, look, we're all talking about agriculture as the way to sustain our communities. But we are not talking about this product, which is an ingredient to actually making agriculture work, which is the soil. And if in a few years' time we are going to run short of soil, how then are we going to succeed in sustaining communities through agriculture?
Well, I think it's important to first start by saying about 95% of the food that we eat is dependent on healthy soils, right? So just as a way of framing it, if we lose soils, we lose our ability to eat. And it's true that we are losing soils at much faster rates than they build up. Soils take huge amounts of time to actually be formed and become fertile enough so that we can grow crops on them. But the way we use our land at the moment, the removal of plants, the plowing and the tillage of those lands to get them ready for agricultural production, our incredible use of pesticides and fertilizers, which erode all the life forms that actually make the soil usable. Those are all disappearing at rates much faster than they can replenish. So we are looking at really dangerous trends in how we manage our soils.
And so I've been following some of the conversations closely on climate change. And right now, as we are speaking, a lot of our colleagues are in Egypt at the COP27. Is this element of soil preservation part of the conversations as we speak?
Hardly. I mean,
and why is that?
Yeah, well, for one, we're struggling to even get food on the agenda of COP. This is going to be the first COP where food is actually, where it's actually featuring. I mean, we recently, with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, which is a group of philanthropies, international philanthropies focused on food systems, they put out a letter to the COP presidency saying put it on the agenda. But soil it's many degrees of separation away from even food in a lot of politicians' mind. They don't see it as a threat at the moment. I'm hoping that the soil scientists come out in full force and really bring it to the attention, because it's a fundamental part. It both contributes to climate change in huge ways and is impacted by droughts, floods, extreme weather events.
Yeah. I suppose it almost sounds impossible when you say in a few years we are going to run short of soil. Most people don't register that because soil is almost in abundance. We see it everywhere we go, we step on it. It's almost like there can never be a time when we run short of soil. But we are talking about soil that will be productive for agricultural purposes. And so that's where the focus should be. Which takes me to where you are located, the African Climate Foundation. For those that don't know much about the foundation, when was it established? What is its mandate? and what are the activities that the foundation is engaged in?
Sure. So the African Climate Foundation it's a relatively young foundation. We've been set up for just over 2 years now. And we were sort of established as a way of recognizing that a lot of international philanthropies wanted to invest in climate change in Africa, but didn't really understand how to. And the narratives that they were using were very much informed by European sort of concepts of how African economies work. And so the recognition was that they needed an African-led, African-based regranter to actually guide and lead how philanthropies look at the sector. So that was the initial establishing point. So we were sort of set up as a regranter back then. But since then, we've grown incredibly quickly. We're expanding into lots of different countries on the continent with different portfolios of work, focused mainly on energy transitions, agriculture and sustainable land use, and then also urban settlements. And I think, maybe one other point to mention here is that we are building ourselves as a thought leader on this nexus between development and climate change. We're seeing development as a fundamental response to addressing any climate responses.
So to most people, again, just we're talking about the issue of soil. To most people, climate is also something that they hear about. Some are beginning to see some physical manifestations of the challenges that are likely to come. But it hasn't really been a key focus of most people, including philanthropists. It's only recent that we see the rise of climate philanthropy. In fact, I don't know what your research is telling you, but a couple of years back, the statistics were that only 2% of global finance goes to climate change. Has there been a change? Are you seeing a change in people's perceptions, but also in people's programming around climate change and its related effects?
Yeah, it is changing.
Yeah.
It's changing, but too slowly at the moment. I think one of the problems. I mean, there've been philanthropies that have been around for a decade or two, and they've been trying to sound alarms, but it hasn't really resonated. And I think one of the reasons for that is that climate change has been seen as strictly an environmental issue that hasn't made its way into developmental narratives. But what we're seeing across the continent especially is that you cannot differentiate between them. The drought in the Horn of Africa this year, putting Somalia, Ethiopia, basically on the brink of famine.
Yeah.
These are issues that require urgent attention from the philanthropic community. And there's really good examples of where philanthropy has actually stepped in to encourage other forms of investment, whether it be foreign direct investment, public investment into a sector because of, better guidance on how to invest. And then also the private sector, de-risking those investments for them. People are making moves, but it is moving too slowly at the moment.
Yeah. And of course, I think before we came on set, we were talking about why you are here at the PASA conference, where the theme is pause, reflect, and almost reset to start thinking about the future. And of course, there's no future without addressing issues of climate and climate change related consequences. But one of the things that you were saying, and I think I agree with you, is that philanthropy is programmed specifically for certain interests. So it's education, it's health, it's poverty, it's inequality, or it's just climate. But those intersections are slowly taking place, but also at a very slow pace. Do you think we could do more in terms of framing and conceptualization so that philanthropists can actually see those intersections? So that when you are programming on education, you must also think about the implications of climate on education. And the same applies climate on inequality, climate on health, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, look, it is very difficult. It's a conversation that I've been having with a few people here today, over the past 2 days. I think the first thing to do, and you mentioned it as being the theme of this event, is to pause, set, and reset, is to realize that climate change at some point will have implications for millions. And it's about famine, and it's about displacement, and it's about putting immense pressure on state resources which are already stretched.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, without an effective climate response, much of the work that most people do becomes obsolete.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the sort of starting point, is that everyone needs to be looking at this. I think what makes it difficult is core mandates of different philanthropies, convincing boards that they need to start branching out in how they look at climate. And I think, sometimes that linkage is a lot clearer for some than it is for others. But I do see groups that are working in that space as being fundamental. So groups like the African Climate Foundation guiding philanthropies so that we're not reinventing the wheel. Yeah. We're looking at groups who are already involved, and we're seeing how we can support them.
And globally, there's already lots of groups that are working on this, your Wings and others. Is it Climate Action that already are focusing on this? But in the African continent, who are the other players that you work with? Because you have been set up, obviously, to coordinate, but also to almost be the anchor for this kind of work. But like you said, others have already been working in this space, maybe without calling their work climate focused. But they could have been focusing on environment, on food security, and other things, which are components of the broader discussion on climate. And so are there already like specific actors that, you can say we are coalescing our efforts together to address the issues of climate change?
Do you mean specifically in the finance space?
Yeah, in the finance space, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing about this is that what we at the ACF really are trying to do is to exactly that. We're not trying to work with the same actors who've been involved. We're trying to show everyone that this is a fundamental issue that needs to be tackled. So when it comes to the finance space, we are working with, we try and bring everyone in. So whether it's private investors, whether it's public sector engagement, all those forms of finance that need to be directed towards more strategic investments, we're working with them. And one clear example is how we've done that with South African Just Energy Transition Partnership.
Yeah. And then, of course, the road to COP27 has several groups working on different asks. What has the road been for you as the foundation? I know one of your colleagues is already there at the COP27. What do you expect to see come out of COP27 for you and the network that you work with?
Sure. And a few things. One is conversations around loss and damage, which is a big discussion about how we adjust to the impacts that climate change has already taken on countries. So whether it be the floods in Nigeria, how do we respond to that? And the financing around that, who pays for those impacts? I'm hoping that a lot more clarity comes out from that. More details on, for example, South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, that 8.5 billion deal that was announced at COP26 last year. We still need details on that. Conversations around food and food security. I mean, COP being in Africa is a real chance for that to feature more prominently, because continents aren't as stressed with food security as Africa is. And so having proper conversations and proper outcomes and commitments made on food security is a real expectation that we're wanting to see on the COP presidency. I mean, there are a number of others, but I think one thing we really want to see is finance actually being moved from just pledges to actually dispersed to those who need.
And of course, at some point, I think I had discussions with Alan and your colleague Faten around the need to establish a network of African philanthropists who are focused solely on climate issues. Would that be something that you think would kind of be a game changer of some sorts? And why is that important?
Sure. I think it would be a game changer. I mean, philanthropies are really well placed for an issue like climate, right? Where initial investments aren't seeing huge returns in the short term, but with different framings around them, you can't not have them. So philanthropy is having that patient capital to invest into projects that have those long-term benefits is fundamental. And when you're able to pool resources like that together and crowd in investment from public and private sectors, I think that's a real game changer. So philanthropies have that fundamental step to play in those sort of first mover positions.
Yeah, and then of course here at IPASA you also made a presentation yesterday. What was your what were your key messages, and what did you make of the interventions and the participation of the different philanthropies that are here?
So I think the one thing I wanted to communicate is that climate change is not some far-off event. It's happening now, and it's going to get a lot worse very quickly. And so we need to be moving much more urgently than we are, and all philanthropies need to play their part. The thing that the conversations that I was having yesterday, I mean, everyone who I spoke to afterwards recognized the need to invest in climate. What was hard is for them to see how to do that. If your core mandate isn't on climate, how do you get involved? And there are ideas. So the IPASA, along with us, developed the climate change toolkit for philanthropies that I would really recommend as a resource. But I mean, there's other things. Philanthropies committing pledges or pledging financing, even if it's not part of your core mandate, supporting the groups that are in that space is another way of doing that.
Are there any climate funds in the continent that philanthropies could contribute to, or groups that are working on climate change and other related environmental issues can also look toward in terms of getting their work supported? I mean, you are in the space, so maybe you could enlighten our viewers on any of the resources that are out there.
Yeah, I'm going to be cheeky and punt ACF. And the reason why I'm going to say that is because, ACF, we're a regranter, right? So we play this funny role of having to fundraise and then disperse funds. But I mean, there are groups, right, who are doing the actual work on the ground that need that kind of support. And working with the ACF to sort of identify those interventions, be thought partners. So even if it's not funding, we can. There's a lot of work that can be done on that sort of co-funding arrangements or thought leadership partnerships that can be developed.
And then of course we are wrapping up, but I'm interested in knowing the person behind the work. How did you end up in soil physics, land management, and now in climate change issues? There has to be something that drove you into this line of work. I wanted to do agriculture when I was in high school, but my parents didn't think it was a useful path to take at the time. It was too specific, but it's a passion I've always had, and the reason why is because I wanted to work in a sector that was always needed. So an issue like food security is something that will never go out of necessity. So that was why I wanted to find myself there. I went into soil physics because I recognized the need for technicians on the continent, specialists who are working on these issues, because we have a lack of expertise on the continent. In fact, I wanted to ask before we proceed, how many do you have an estimate of how many soil are there soil physicists? Do you have an estimate of how many there are? I think it's my first time meeting one.
I've met about 4 or 5 in South Africa. I can't give an estimate of how many there are. I don't know if we have a good database of that. But there aren't many. That's the worry. I think a lot of people are soil physicists by their training, and they maybe not call themselves that. A lot of farmers who do tracking of their farms are in many ways soil scientists. But I did a lot of my activism around environmental and social justice issues. So that's what's driven me to stay in the space and work on the climate one, because it is so all-encompassing.
I mean, I know I kind of did not ask you this, but it would be unfair for me not to ask, given the world affairs now. How is it possible that the war between Russia and Ukraine leads to Africa struggling with food?
So in many ways, right? So the first is that a lot of our food security is based on imports. As a continent, we're a huge net importer of foods. And for staples like maize and wheat, most of those come from Russia and Ukraine. So when you have disruptions to supply lines there, we have huge implications for local food security needs. That's the first one. There was also the rise in fertilizer prices because those supply chains got disrupted, which meant that a lot of farmers, it resulted in them not planting as much for different seasons. When you have less being planted, it hikes prices at different points in the value chain. And the way that our food systems and our markets are structured in the continent, those shocks have drastic implications. I mean, recent research that we supported, it showed that we had food price hikes of about 30 to 40% higher than they should have been in Kenya. And that was a combination of climate change and Russia-Ukraine war.
And being in a continental foundation, are you doing anything with the SADC, for example, with the African Union, especially around these issues, in particular with the big continental bodies like your SADC and your African Union?
We do have engagements, and it's critical that we have engagements, especially with regional bodies who can facilitate better trade management schemes. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is one that we're keeping a close eye on and seeing how we can feed our work into those conversations. So that same report that I just mentioned, we found that having less maize produced in Kenya could have been compensated with better trade routes to Tanzania, who had bumper crops that year, which results in better prices for farmers and better prices for consumers at the end of each value chain. So we do have conversations with the AU, with ECOWAS, and SADC to really facilitate these agreements.
That was Malik from the African Climate Foundation. Thank you for watching. Join us next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.